We're absolutely delighted and privileged to have Rohit Talwar with us today. He's come all the way from London. Rohit is a futurist, he's an author, he's a CEO of a company called Fast Future, and he's an entrepreneur, so he puts his money where his mouth is, actually gets things done, but he talks everything about the future. Today is about the future. Today is all about basically building and understanding the deep the deep feelings that we have when we talk about the future. And in this process, he's published a new book, A Very Human Future, which resonates with me a lot, because this is when I go out, also as a fellow futurist, this is a futurist interview almost, I talk about humanity way more than we talk about technology. So we're going to talk to Rohit about all of his experiences, and welcome, Rohit. It's a real pleasure to have you here. Lovely to have you in Dubai, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us about what inspired you to write this book, because you have done many books in the past, but now you are into the humanity piece.
Well, what we've been seeing over the last few years is a growing focus and expectation that tech was the answer to everything. That tech would solve all our problems, tech would liberate the whole of humanity, and it didn't matter if technology took away our jobs, because people could go off and be landscape gardeners or do the sculptures that they'd always intended to do. But the problem is most of humanity doesn't think that way, and a lot of people are very scared by the technology, and we've been seeing that increasingly from individual citizens through to politicians, a real fear that we're powerless in the face of the speed and scale of technology. So what we wanted to do was to create a very optimistic book that said, okay, you can't hold back the pace of innovation, but what you need to do is accelerate the pace of human development so that people can actually cope with what's going on. And this is all about what are the experiments we need to start doing today to prepare for a range of possible futures, but to make sure that humanity is in the lead in all of those, and that the technology is serving humanity.
One of the phrases that I use is, what got us here won't get us there. Can you shock us with the kinds of things that are going to fundamentally fall into a chasm in terms of the past, like legal qualifications or accountancy or things like that? Are they all going into a chasm, or is there something different there?
Well, I think there's a couple of things happening to the professions. One is that the boundaries are blurry. You now have accountants doing legal work, lawyers trying to create accountancy practices, and management consultancies saying they can do it all, and then the tech vendors saying actually we can do everything they do, but digitally and in the flow of transactions. And so everyone is having to redefine their profession and then their place in the value chain. And that is a real challenge for a lot of people. On the one hand, there are those professionals trying to fight it. There are the others who just think that there's an inevitable chasm coming and we're going to fall in. And then there are a most interesting group who are saying, now, how do we innovate and create a new model for what our service looks like that might combine tech, legal, accounting and consulting expertise? Because clients very rarely want a legal solution, they want a business solution.
When I talk to business leaders, over 90% of them are saying that technology and the digitization of a digital revolution that we have will fundamentally change the world. How do you square up this huge gap in the middle of 60-70% of people who are just not being able to cope?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of business leaders have fallen for the mythology that tech will save us, that tech will answer all our questions. And the reality is that tech is only as good as the people who are executing it. So what we hear on a regular basis is that $800 billion are wasted every year on IT projects that go wrong. More than half of that is poor digital literacy. The people at the top not understanding the technology and how to use it and what it makes possible. The people in the middle of the organization, the managers and staff, not being trained enough to use the new technologies and work out how to get the best from them. So they still try and use them the way they did the previous set of systems.
Right.
And then finally, tech developers. Not all tech developers are born equal, and not investing enough in those people. So on the one hand, we hear leaders saying we lack skills, we don't have the resources. But on the other hand, you see the investment they're making in people is pitiful compared to the investment they're making in technology. And the risk is we end up automating our businesses without thinking about it. And therefore we end up taking people out, we end up commoditizing, price drops, and then we end up not having a business. And I think that that to me is my biggest fear, that around 30% of the companies we see today, we see no future for them in the way they're currently thinking about their organization.
Yeah.
And making decisions that almost no one in the organization understands because almost no one understands the tech.
One of the theses I have is that 20th century companies are collapsing because they were designed for the 20th century to manage risk, to maintain assets and think differently, while the 21st century companies are now coming up because they are coping with risk and change and shift. And this 10-year, 15-year sort of transition decade that I see, this is where the biggest challenges are. So, and this is all in our lifetimes. What are the sort of things that we have some people here from large corporations and so on? What are the sort of things that they should be looking at literally tomorrow morning?
So what you see is that that transition period. We call it the messy middle,
Okay.
where you can see the sunlit upland, but where you are today, you can't even find the shore to get across there. And the problem is that the new players coming through are very flat in their organisation. They recruit very bright people. They make sure everyone gets what they're doing. So when they move or when they pivot, the company goes with them quickly.
Right.
We have organisations where a lot of people have been asked to be robots. They're doing very robotic tasks. They're not asked to think. When we want their opinion, we'll give it to them. And we're not really taking our people with us. And we've had this nonsense messagery for the last 20 years about empowerment, and yet you don't see it changing. So we need extraordinary leadership in a period where the future is very uncertain and the ways of getting there are very uncertain. You can't just lead from the front, because now people are leading from the front, they're looking behind them and they're seeing no one's following. You've actually got to enable your whole organisation. You've got to start listening, because the people in the organisation, the staff, are the ones who have the best sense of how the market is responding, how customers are responding, what suppliers are saying. But they're also the ones who are stuck in a paradigm that you enforced on them. And when we start to say become listeners, start to hear where your organisation is, a lot of corporate leaders are horrified about what they hear. They're people, they want to cringe because their people sound naive, they sound ill-informed, and they sound resistant to change.
Yeah.
And so they'd rather just put tech in their place. But actually our view is no, what you have to do in that situation is start from where they're listening. You've got to get out to them and understand how they see the world, and then start your education processes and your personal development processes from there, not from where you'd like them to be. And then you can do some very clever stuff very quickly in terms of helping people see how the world is changing. So one of the easiest tools we have for people to use is video. 30 to 90 second videos that you find all over the internet about how the world is changing, new models of construction, new models of education, how tech is changing industries. And if you just have people absorb that for a couple of weeks, for 3 minutes a day, you start to crack through the permafrost. You start to get them seeing that the world is changing. The corporation can give them something, but they need to take a lot more ownership of their own learning. And that's the challenge now, is learning is the center of the new leadership.
Let's do a little flashback. Have you been a techie? Where did you start from, and what was your inspiration to moving towards becoming a futurist? Because this is not something that my parents would understand, and neither would yours.
So, absolutely. I started my life at British Telecom in the UK, and in their artificial intelligence unit.
They had one then?
This was in the 80s. When I joined, I discovered that there were 6 of them across the business who didn't talk to each other. And what was interesting is we were really dealing with very futurist stuff. But the problem is the organisation didn't want us to talk about it to them or to anyone else, because it was just so far in advance of where they were.
Yeah.
And what I realised was that I needed to get into a broader world. So I gradually evolved into Anderson Consulting as was, and then into a smaller firm, and then on my own, so that I had more and more freedom to talk about the future and how you explore it, rather than the future as a prediction.
You were an outlier because your company, Fast Future, perhaps you would like to talk to us about that. It's been there for almost 20 years, and that is quite incredible, because when I was researching, I actually couldn't find that many companies who were focused on the future 20 years ago. What inspired you to create Fast Future?
At the time, it was really about having our own research and creating our own approaches to looking at the future, rather than just using other people's.
Yeah.
And creating insights about the future that touch people at a personal level, rather than just a pure numbers level. To really try and get people to think about, what does that mean for me? What does that mean for my career? What does that mean for my family? And how do I make future-informed decisions? So that was where I was coming from. And then 3 years ago, we decided to create this publishing business and roll everything into it. And we'd got very excited about this whole exponential thing. Could you really tap into exponential thinking and apply it to an everyday business? And so we tried, and we grew the business eightfold from year one to year three. And we're hoping that we continue that process of exponential in this year. And that's about taking off all the control. So people hate us when they look at how we're managed. Like, we have no business plan, we set no targets, people have no personal budgets, they just spend what they need to when they need to. We've never told anyone off. Like, literally, we have never had an argument with anyone. We just talk about what went wrong, what happened, what was the learning.
Yes.
And our most frequent answer is yes, to anything anyone wants to do, and then things go wrong. But that's great because you learn from them. The other thing we've done is, this is terrible for men to hear, but the men don't last very long in our organisation.
Okay.
It moves fast, it moves too quickly. The ownership issue is a challenge for a lot of guys because they want to know exactly what they're owning, not how do I negotiate it.
Right.
So the team is 60% women.
Okay.
And they get on, and I have no idea how many committees and organisation things they do behind the scenes, but they just get stuff done. And it's incredible. When you trust people, you don't need the business plans and things. You just need to kind of keep giving them rocket fuel.
It's interesting you say that you don't need a business plan. Isn't the brain and aren't we as human beings goal-driven and objective-driven, or are we more relational?
We've led ourselves to believe that goals are everything. And I think goals are great, and I understand why in a big organisation turning over, 5 billion dirham, you have to have some structures for allocating resources. We don't, we're tiny compared to that. So ours is much more about relational driven. What does your heart see? What is your passion right now? How might we create a book around your passion? Who might we engage in contributing?
Yep.
And then how do we get it to market in a way that reflects that passion?
I was fascinated. I picked up the information on your book yesterday, and you talk about society, you talk about cities, smart cities, and we're in a city which is designed to be smart. We're in an environment which has, it's a smart environment, as you can see. Is this a fad or is this real?
I think what's going to happen is you'll see a number of cities that make a good stab at putting in place a digital infrastructure to support the citizen, and that will work well. I'm guessing Dubai and Singapore and a couple of others will be there. You'll have others that have a lot of tech, but there's always a slight dissatisfaction that the investment in tech hasn't been paid off in the benefits to society. And then you'll have a whole bunch of people who've been sold on this by the vendors, but they've never really thought through what being a smart city means in human terms. What do we want our city to be? What industries do we want to be in? What jobs do we want? What kind of lifestyles do we want? How do we want to manage our relationship with the environment? They're kind of assuming that tech will solve all that. But actually you have to make very human decisions and then have the smart city infrastructure underpin that.
I think a lot about learning and development, and there are people here who represent schools and so on. What are the key things that they should be aware of in terms of how we prepare our young people? You're a father and you have children. What are you telling them? You must be a super dad. I mean, you've obviously guided them in the right direction. So
there's three people who would argue with that. Actually, four if you include their mother. I think we're at a stage now where education systems around the world are kind of grinding to a crunching halt in terms of the current model, which is all about trying to impart knowledge, turn you into an economic unit of production, and then put you onto the production line.
Yeah.
That's not working anymore. We need people who can think. We also know that a child coming into school today under the age of 10 in a lot of developed and developing countries has a good chance of living to about somewhere between 115 and 120. We have no idea whether jobs will exist in even 50 years' time, and we certainly have no idea what jobs those kids will do in 20 years' time when they come into the workplace. So whilst we need to teach them literacy, mathematics, reading, all those things, we also need to give them the skills that allow them to move from job to job. Accelerated learning, problem solving, collaboration, self-management, scenario thinking, or emotional literacy, all those things that actually help you perform well, connect with people in the workplace and learn a new job quickly. Gradually some people are starting to eke that into their schooling systems, but the desire is always there to try and do it through technology. And actually these are very human skills. And so the challenge is, you know, for most people is to get to as good as Finland is right now. They've created an online learning tool for the whole of the population to access for free, to teach them about AI and to take them from a basic level to quite a sophisticated level of understanding so that they can map out how they're going to manage their own future. That is incredible. You know, that I think is a great move. And I think that's where we need to be going with education, is waking people up, giving them transferable skills that help them move from job to job, and helping them realize they've got to take ownership of their own learning as quickly as possible.
Sometimes worry about a dystopian future, and I think AI is right here in terms of sort of simple AI, but artificial general intelligence in the future, and then artificial superintelligence in the deep future. That's going to start taking over a lot. So my view is, well, why artificial intelligence? Why not this brain here? Why don't we develop this much more in our thinking and metacognition, and then develop our sort of multiple intelligences rather than just the simple ones? And I find, I don't say resistance, but I find bewilderment most of the time. Like, what the hell is this guy talking about in terms of multiple intelligences being brought into this thing? So to me, AI is subservient. We are here, and we need to find ways to work this. Am I on the right track?
Well, you're an enlightened being, so you see that. But the reality is that most of us like quick fixes.
Mm-hmm.
So pretty much everyone who hears you probably at some level believes you,
Mm-hmm.
but then they're not doing it in their own lives. They're not tapping into those multiple intelligences, and they kind of are aware that there's more in there that they're not bringing out. So there's a tendency to go for the quick fix solution, which is finding a tech that can do it for us. This is the classic thing with superintelligence that says, okay, we'll get to artificial general intelligence that's as smart as us, superintelligence will be smarter, and it will work out how to solve all our problems. It will create new governance systems, new financial systems. It will work out how to distribute food more effectively so we don't have world hunger. And that's certainly the goal of a lot of the people working in the AI field, is to get to artificial general intelligence, then superintelligence, and then to the singularity where we can network our brains together, share our dreams, know what each other's thinking before we open our mouths. To me, there's nothing more horrendous to think about than to imagine or to be able to know what the other person is thinking while they're talking to me.
Right.
I'm quite happy living with the lie of what they're saying. You know?
It's fair
Let them keep their thoughts to themselves. But you know, we talk about this a lot. The sort of 7 stages to nirvana for the AI people of, you know, how you go from expert systems through chatbots through, you know, different layers till get to superintelligence.
So it's a brand new book, and I'm sure we'll enjoy reading it. What core message do you want us to take away from this?
The critical thing is that we have to start doing the experiments now around how we ensure a good future for humanity, from mental health to education to job support to job creation to creation of new industries. We need to be doing that now in quite a radical way because we don't know what's going to work. We can argue ideologically about these things, but we have to do the experiments, see what the evidence comes out as, and then be in a position to respond. We don't know if AI will create more jobs than it destroys. My guess is probably more. It will destroy more than it creates. But we don't want to wait until that happens to start acting or thinking. Let's do the thinking now and start getting people taking ownership of their own lives so we can make sure that the tech serves humanity.
A positive and a negative. What's the biggest fear that you have and that we should all be sharing? And then what's the biggest opportunity that we have in front of us that we should be tapping into?
The biggest fear is apathy, that we start to say, you know, these tech giants are so powerful, they dominate everything, we have no say over this, let's just let them take over our lives and we'll take the free goodies. The biggest hope is I see huge numbers of initiatives now around the world which are about reskilling people, raising digital literacy, getting the unemployed back into work, but also creating their own jobs and getting people to think slightly bigger about society and where it's going and what's our responsibility. And really starting to make more socially responsible decisions, whether it's about tech, the environment, or the way we educate our kids.
And finally, what action should they be taking first thing tomorrow morning in terms of, having read this book, what's your advice?
So I would start the conversation, whether it's in your family, with your friends, in your workplace, is just getting people to go out and start looking at ideas about how the world is changing through these little videos, Mashable, World Economic Forum, futurism, they all have these. So whether it's a village learning how to power itself,
Yeah.
you know, through to people coming up with game-changing tech ideas, just have people watch a few of these every day and then start to have a conversation a week and 2 weeks' time about what does this tell us, what are you learning, what does it tell us about how the world is changing, what could that mean for our lives, for our business, where do we need to really start to put some attention because it's been a blind spot.
I see.
Don't start that conversation now because you'll have the same old arguments. Start that conversation in 2 weeks' time when people have been out and learnt some new stuff, and hopefully you've cracked some of the permafrost, they're seeing some different things, and then you're having a very different conversation.
Brilliant. But thank you very, very much indeed, Rohit. It's a real
Thank you.
pleasure, real privilege.